Canada, a quiet giant of history and civilization. Canada is one of the most unique and quietly powerful countries in the world. You won't often see it dominating global geopolitical headlines, but when it comes to the quality of life, Canada consistently ranks near the top. It quietly evolves in the shadow of its louder neighbor, the United States, which tends to draw more political and media attention across the continent. But what kind of country is Canada? This vast landmass, the second largest nation on Earth. Where did it come from? Who were its earliest inhabitants? And what were the ancestors of today's hockey fans really like? Sit back, and over the next few minutes, we'll take you on a journey deep into Canada's rich and often overlooked past. And as always, let us know in the comments which countries you'd like us to explore in future episodes. Let's begin far, far back in time. For many years, the dominant theory held that humans first reached North America from Asia around 12,000 years ago, crossing a land bridge that once connected Siberia and Alaska. This theory is supported by genetic analysis, which shows a clear connection between ancient Indigenous peoples in Canada and Asian ancestry. However, recent discoveries have challenged this timeline. Archaeological sites in the Yukon suggest human activity dating back 26,000 years, possibly even 50,000 years. This pushes the migration of early humans much further back and implies that people have inhabited present-day Canada for far longer than previously believed. The evidence is compelling, making this theory more and more accepted in scientific circles. What is more broadly agreed upon is that the ancestors of Indigenous Canadians migrated southward first, long before settling the Arctic. Contrary to popular belief, the Inuit, or Eskimos, were not the first settlers of Canada, but among the last waves to arrive. The harsh glacial landscape of ancient Canada made it nearly uninhabitable for early humans, pushing them to settle in more temperate zones. Despite the lack of written records, we know that Indigenous cultures in Canada were anything but primitive. There were around 12 distinct language families, 50 tribal confederacies, and sophisticated economies based on trade, hunting, and even farming. In the eastern part of what is now Canada, tribes like the Hurons, Ottawas, and Iroquois built permanent villages, developed trade routes, and engaged in complex diplomacy. One remarkable achievement was the creation of the Iroquois Confederacy, a political alliance of 5 powerful nations, arguably one of the earliest models of federal democracy. Interestingly, Canada avoided colonization for a while, even surviving the Vikings. Around the 11th century, Icelandic Norse explorers led by Leif Erikson landed in Newfoundland and built a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Artifacts dated to the year 1021 confirm the Viking presence. While they likely made contact with local indigenous people, the Norse didn't stay long and may never have intended to colonize the region. There's even genetic evidence suggesting a native woman was brought to Iceland during this period. Her descendants still live there today. Here in Newfoundland, we also find the roots of some problematic historical terms. The local Beothuk people painted their bodies and clothes with red ochre, which led to early European settlers referring to them, wrongly and offensively, as redskins. This term, unfortunately, became generalized to all indigenous peoples of North America. And as for the term Indians, that originated from early European explorers who mistakenly believed they had reached India. Initially, European involvement in Canada was limited to fishing, mapping, and small trading missions. But as colonial ambitions spread, so did European settlement. In fact, Canada became a colonial target even earlier than some parts of what is now the United States. And that's just the beginning of Canada's deep and often overlooked history, full of forgotten civilizations, misunderstood cultures, and quiet strength. From Cartier to British rule, the colonial transformation. In 1534, French explorer Jacques Cartier made his historic journey to the New World. He navigated the Gulf of St. Lawrence and landed near what is now Quebec. Upon arrival, Cartier erected a cross in the soil, declaring the land to be the property of the King of France. During his expedition, Cartier encountered leaders of the Iroquois people. From their language, he overheard the word Canada, meaning village. Misinterpreting the term, Cartier applied Canada to the entire region. By the mid-16th century, the name Canada was appearing on European maps, referring to the lands around modern-day Quebec. At that time, the French crown granted exclusive rights over the fur trade to French merchants. Rich in fur-bearing animals, the Canadian wilderness suddenly became incredibly valuable. Despite harsh conditions, French settlers, known as les habitants, pushed into the continent. In 1605, they founded Port Royal in present-day Nova Scotia, and just 3 years later, Quebec City was established, becoming the capital of what was called New France. These were not large cities, but primarily trading outposts. The fur trade flourished, and Catholic missionaries began arriving in 1615. In 1617, Louis Hébert became the first settler not directly involved in trade or navigation, often regarded as Canada's first true colonist. Canadian schoolbooks often highlight that colonization here was less brutal than in the United States. While there's some truth, Samuel de Champlain, the first governor of Quebec, forged alliances with tribes like the Hurons. The broader story tells a more familiar tale. Initial cooperation gave way to exploitation and eventually displacement. As New France grew, Indigenous communities were pushed out of their lands. Worse still, European diseases devastated Indigenous populations. With no natural immunity to smallpox, cholera, malaria, and other imported plagues, many tribes lost more than half their populations. Despite their alliances with some tribes, French colonists were not fundamentally different from the British in how they expanded territory and imposed their culture. But the 17th century brought another power into the picture, the English. Britain was increasingly uneasy about French dominance in North America, exploiting tensions among indigenous nations, particularly the rivalry between the Hurons and the Iroquois. The British made strategic alliances, especially with the Iroquois, supplying them with weapons and goods. This triggered a violent cycle. The Iroquois launched brutal raids against the Hurons and vice versa, as war erupted in Europe between France and England. The 30 Years' War, conflict spilled into the New World. In 1629, the British Kirk brothers even seized Quebec, holding it for 3 years and disrupting French trade. Meanwhile, English colonies like New England and Newfoundland began thriving, far outpacing their French counterparts in population and resources. France responded by formalizing New France as an official royal colony, but the British momentum was hard to match. The British launched fur trading operations through the Hudson's Bay Company, deepened their alliance with the Iroquois, and surrounded New France from multiple fronts. In 1690, they attempted to seize Quebec again. Though unsuccessful, they remained persistent. After the War of Spanish Succession, Britain's dominance in the region was acknowledged formally. And when the 7 Years' War broke out, New France's fate was sealed. In 1759, 13,000 British troops clashed with 9,000 French forces in the Battle of Quebec. The British had the advantage in artillery and strategy. The French garrison collapsed. The subsequent Treaty of Paris, 1763, officially handed over all of New France to Britain. It was renamed the province of Quebec and brought under British rule. Interestingly, the British made efforts to respect the French-speaking population. They allowed the use of French civil law while keeping British criminal law. They also protected Catholic religious freedoms. These efforts were formalized in the Quebec Act of 1774, now seen as a foundational document in Canadian history. But not everyone celebrated the new order. Just 2 years later, in 1776, the American Revolution erupted. Canada, then firmly under British control, became a strategic refuge for loyalists who opposed American independence. Modern Canada, a nation balancing heritage, identity, and change. As Canada grew, it gradually adopted many cultural goods, holidays, and influences from its southern neighbor, the United States. American political influence also seeped in, often through powerful lobbies. In the second half of the 20th century, much like earlier in its history, Canada began pushing back against that influence, seeking to assert its own national identity. At the same time, the country was also navigating deep internal tensions between its French and English-speaking populations. In Quebec, French was promoted in schools and public life, sometimes at the expense of English. Meanwhile, English-speaking provinces occasionally resisted French language policies, creating cultural friction. These language and identity struggles led to major policy reforms. In 1969, Canada officially adopted bilingualism. Government services, education, and even court trials were now required to be accessible in both French and English. The country began a careful effort to balance the needs of both linguistic communities. Still, Quebec wasn't fully satisfied. Calls for independence gained momentum. In the 1995 sovereignty referendum, the province came within just a few percentage points of seceding from Canada. Despite this near split, the country remained united and continued evolving. Today, Canada maintains a strong cultural identity while still depending economically and politically on its big brother, the United States. Yet this dependence hasn't prevented Canada from consistently ranking among the world's top nations for quality of life and immigration appeal. Canada's journey shows that modern history is far from complete. Many of the country's ongoing challenges, territorial definitions, cultural integration, and language rights, are rooted in the past. For example, not all regions of Canada even have distinct names. The Northwest Territories, partially redefined in 1999, still carry provisional designations. Canada is a country shaped by four powerful cultural forces: British, French, American, and Indigenous. Indigenous peoples, who have historically suffered marginalization, are now reclaiming space politically and culturally and are central to Canada's evolving identity. Ultimately, Canada reminds us that history isn't a finished story. It's an ongoing process. And in observing the changes a country like Canada goes through, we witness how nations adapt, heal, and grow across generations.